Thank you very much for that introduction, and for everybody from the university who's been involved in organising tonight's event, and most importantly for all of you who've joined me here this evening. It's a great pleasure to be back in the city of Portsmouth and not under arrest. It is some time ago, but in 1987, from this fair city, the replica First Fleet was beckoned off to reenact the first landings and settlement in Sydney, Australia. And together with Aboriginal activists, I was involved in a protest here in Portsmouth as the Queen sent off the replica First Fleet. Our point was to commemorate not the colonisation of Australia by the English, but the decimation and oppression of the indigenous Aboriginal peoples. I had a placard up under my jacket which said 1788, that was the year they actually landed at Sydney Cove, 1788, 750,000 Aboriginal people. 1920, 120,000 Aboriginal people. Those statistics, I think, summarise the genocide that was perpetrated against the original Australians. I wasn't even allowed to hold the placard. I was spotted by a police spotter team and snatched from the crowd and spent the next nearly 24 hours in Portsmouth Police Station, together with several other activists who were variously snatched from the crowd subsequently as well. We were taken to court and bailed to appear, and then eventually, I think a month or two later, when we were about to appear, suddenly all the charges were dropped. We made our point, but not as we would have liked to have. So I have some fond memories of Portsmouth and some not so fond memories. So it's nice to be back here when such a repeat is very unlikely to happen. I guess my starting point tonight is that we have made huge progress for LGBTI rights in this country. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex rights. Huge, huge progress in a very, very short space of time. Think about it. Until the period post-1999, Britain had by volume the largest number of anti-gay laws of any country in the world. Some of them dating back centuries. And yet here we are, just over a decade later, and we have some of the best laws in the world. That has been a phenomenal, successful social reform campaign. Probably the fastest, biggest, most successful law reform campaign in British history. To think that all those laws, all those diverse homophobic laws, biphobic laws, transphobic laws, have been successively repealed in just over a decade. And it's not down to me or any other individual or organisation. It's down to our collective efforts. It's down to people like yourselves, grassroots campaigners in towns and cities and villages up and down the country who've said to themselves, we've had enough, we want change. And it's your lobbying effort, your petitioning of your members of parliament, your marching in the streets that have brought us to this place where we have mostly very good laws. But of course, having laws is one thing, changing social attitudes and values is a different thing. So we've made great progress on the legal front. And indeed, the legalisation of same-sex marriage is the culmination of that law reform campaign. The ban on same-sex marriage was the last major anti-gay law on the statute books. All the other ones were eventually removed. Now I want to just add a little caveat. The criminalisation of male homosexuality did not end, as many people think, in England and Wales in 1967. It didn't end until 2003. It's only with the Sexual Offences Act of that year that all the criminalisations were finally repealed. So the law against gross indecency, which just means any sex between men other than anal intercourse, including mere sexual touching and kissing, the law that convicted Alan Turing in 1952, the law that sent Oscar Wilde to prison in 1895. That law was only finally repealed in 2003. The law against anal sex, passed in the reign of King Henry VIII in 1533, was only finally repealed in 2003. It's only since that year that we have a criminal code that does not discriminate based on sexual orientation. And of course, you know all the other things, the equalisation of the age of consent, the right of same-sex couples to foster and adopt children, the end to the ban on lesbian and gay service personnel in the armed forces, civil partnerships, protection against discrimination in employment and the provision of goods and services. All these things and many others have happened post-1999. As I said, the ban on same-sex marriage was the last major legal discrimination. And it's great that we've got it. It's great that we finally have the right of same-sex couples to marry if they wish. And I say that as someone who's spearheaded the campaign from way back in 1992. It was in that year that Outrage, the LGBTI human rights group, began the battle for same-sex marriage when 5 of our couples in the group filed applications for a marriage licence at Westminster Register Office in London. They were, of course, all refused, but that was the opening shot in the campaign. And then it was reinvigorated with the formation of the Equal Love campaign in 2010, which had the twin objectives of ending both the legal ban on same-sex marriages and the legal ban on opposite-sex civil partnerships. We were committed to the principle of equality for LGBTI people and for our straight friends and allies as well. We wanted the civil partnership law and the marriage law to be open to everyone. Well, with same-sex marriage, we've won half the battle, but not the other half. Still, the government is refusing to allow opposite-sex couples to have a civil partnership. And that is discrimination, and in my view, just as reprehensible as discrimination in law against LGBTI people. Now, when it comes to same-sex marriage, we've got it, but it's definitely not equality. It's not equal marriage, which is what we argued for. It's not marriage equality. It is same-sex marriage, but different. So we now have a situation where we have 2 marriage laws. The 1949 Marriage Act, which is for opposite-sex couples only, and the 2013 Marriage Act, which is for same-sex couples only. So we've ended up with a system of segregation in marriage law. Segregation based on sexual orientation. I argued that rather than introduce a new same-sex marriage law, all the government had to do was repeal the ban on same-sex marriage. That's all we had to do. We didn't need to go through this whole convoluted process of a new legal framework. Because under the 1949 Marriage Act, there is no ban on same-sex marriage. It simply says two persons. It doesn't specify they have to be male and female. The ban on same-sex marriage, in fact, was only introduced in 1971 in response to attempts by same-sex couples, and in particular trans people like April Ashley, to either marry or get their marriages recognised. So in reaction to that, the government of the day introduced the ban under the Nullity of Marriage Act 1971, which was later transferred into the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1973. So all the government actually had to do was repeal the prohibition in the 1973 Act and revert to the 1949 Act. That's all it had to do. But it chose instead to enshrine segregation in marriage law. And as you know, there are some disturbing differences and discriminations embodied in this new law. We can rejoice that we have same-sex marriage in England and Wales and in Scotland, but let's not forget that the ban on same-sex marriage still exists in Northern Ireland. And despite 2 attempts, the Democratic Unionist Party has vetoed legislation for same-sex marriage. It's now under appeal in an upcoming legal case, and I'm fairly confident it will win either in the Northern Irish courts, or if that fails, it will go to the European Court of Human Rights and stand a pretty good chance of winning. But why? Why, oh why, is one part of this United Kingdom holding out against same-sex marriage? So that's one problem. Another issue, of course, is that there is enshrined in the law in England and Wales, but thankfully not in Scotland, the so-called spousal veto. This is where, in a marriage, one partner happens to be trans. The law states that they have to get the approval of their spouse before they can get a gender recognition certificate. Now, in marriage law, you're not required to get the approval of your spouse to move abroad, to undergo dramatic medical treatment, to end a marriage, and umpteen other things. But the government said when it comes to gender recognition, you have to get your spouse's permission. That is discrimination against trans people, and it's wrong. There's also the issue of the way in which there is a quadruple lock on the Church of England and the Church of Wales conducting same-sex religious marriages. Now, of course, certainly at the moment, we were content that religious bodies were not forced to conduct same-sex marriages. But we argued they should have the option to do so if they wish to. And indeed, in the legislation of the Same-Sex Marriage Act, it does state that if a religious body wants to conduct a same-sex marriage, it will be allowed to do so, except for the Church of England and the Church of Wales. Why should those 2 particular churches be singled out for specific prohibitions? To me, it's not only homophobic, it's also an attack upon religious freedom. It's saying that even if the Church of England and the Church of Wales want to conduct same-sex marriages in a place of worship, they are prohibited from doing so. Another related issue is, of course, the way in which the legislation states that if a religious organisation shares its premises with other denominations, all of them have to agree that same-sex marriages are legitimate, valid and okay. So, for example, lots of the smaller faith groups like the Unitarians, the Quakers, the Metropolitan Community Church, and in some cases Liberal Judaism, they share their premises with other faith groups. They can't afford to have their own premises, so they share premises. So, for example, in London, the Metropolitan Community Church share their place of worship on a rota basis with various African and evangelical churches. And under this legislation, the government is saying that these other churches have a right to veto the Metropolitan Community Church from conducting same-sex religious marriages. It doesn't seem right that one denomination should be able to veto same-sex marriage by another. There's also the issue of the inequality when it comes to pension inheritance. So compared to an opposite-sex marriage under the 1949 Act, in a same-sex marriage, if one partner dies, the surviving partner will have potentially a lesser claim on their deceased partner's pension contributions. So if you're in a straight marriage under the 1949 Act, if you've been contributing to your pension pot since 1960 and you die, your surviving partner will be able to claim all of your pension contributions going back to 1960. But under the Same-Sex Marriage Act, in law, you will only be able to claim your partner's contributions from 2005, or in some cases from 1988. But if the person who died has been paying in since 1960, that will mean the loss of at least 28 years of pension contribution. A dire financial penalty on the surviving partner, purely and simply because they're in a same-sex marriage. And the same discrimination, of course, applies to same-sex civil partners. They too suffer discrimination in pension and inheritance. Another issue which is mindful is the way in which there are various little anomalies, like, for example, under the 1949 Marriage Act, non-consummation and adultery are grounds for the annulment of a marriage or divorce. That doesn't apply to same-sex marriages. Now, I don't particularly think that, adultery or non-consummation should be a grounds, automatically at least, for an annulment or avoiding of a marriage. But again, it shows the discrimination that's embodied, or the differential that's embodied in the same-sex marriage legislation. So that's one issue of unfinished business. Another one is the fact that we have fantastic new equality laws. I can remember when I stood for election for Labour in the Bermondsey by-election in 1983, one of my very so-called radical extremist ideas was to create a single, uniform, comprehensive Equality Act to protect everyone against discrimination and to guarantee equal treatment. It took 4 decades before we eventually got the Equality Act of 2010. And it's a very fine piece of legislation. It guarantees equality and non-discrimination for everyone. But written into that legislation are certain limited, qualified exemptions for religious organisations. They're exempt from the provisions of the Equality Act and indeed other equality laws on the statute books. They are allowed to discriminate against LGBTI people if they can show that it goes against their religious ethos. If it does, and they can demonstrate it, they can discriminate in employment and in service provision. This doesn't just apply to places of worship like churches, mosques, synagogues, and temples. It also applies to faith-run schools, hospitals, nursing homes, and shelters for the homeless. Now, I will defend the right of religious people to hold their views. And I'm disappointed if they're against gay equality and if they hold homophobic views, but in a free and democratic society, they're entitled to hold that point of view. What they're not entitled to do, or rather what they should not be entitled to do, is to discriminate against other people, whether on any grounds, including on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. So it is quite extraordinary that the Equality Act allows religious organisations, including faith schools, to be above the law, to not be required to ensure equal treatment in the way that is an obligation legally on everyone else. And this wasn't an oversight, this was deliberate. You know, in the clauses of the Equality Act around harassment and around schools, it specifically says these provisions shall not apply on the grounds of sexual orientation or gender identity. That was written into the law by a Labour government. A Labour government. So quite clearly, that is unfinished business. I think it's time we said that these loopholes or exemptions should be closed, that religious organisations should be subject to the same legal obligations as everyone else. Another issue is, of course, the scandalous level of homophobic, biphobic and transphobic bullying in our schools. Over 50% of young LGBTI people say that they have suffered or witnessed or experienced homophobic bullying in the classroom or the school playground. That's shocking, truly shocking. And it ranges from name-calling to threats, abuse, insults, and actual physical violence. A school should be a place of safety for young people, for all young people. Yet for many, many LGBTI young people, it's not. It's a place of fear, harassment, and victimization. And given these statistics, what is even more shocking is the fact that less than half of the schools in this country have an anti-bullying program that specifically addresses homophobic, biphobic, and transphobic bullying. Less than half. It's interesting that in faith schools, the level of bullying on some reports is greater than in other schools. And that faith schools do the least to do something to combat it. Again, there is a problem with some elements of religion. There are many fine religious people who support LGBTI equality, but institutionally, most religious organisations in this country, the main ones anyway, are complicit in discrimination against LGBTI people. And of course, with this scale of bullying, it's not surprising that the rates of anxiety, depression, mental health, self-harm, and even attempted suicide are much higher than average among young LGBTI people. Much, much higher than average. And in particular, extremely excessively high with regard to trans young kids. You know, it's appalling to think that so many young LGBTI people feel so alienated, so threatened, that they will play truant, that they will change their educational plans, that they will drop out of school at an early age, as soon as they've got the legal entitlement to do so. That's truly shocking. So to me, there's a wake-up call there. A very important wake-up call, which needs to be heeded by government, and which so far has not been. First of all, I'd say that I'd like to see equality and diversity lessons made mandatory in every school in this country from the first year of primary education, ongoing throughout a pupil's school life. And these lessons should tackle not just anti-LGBT attitudes and prejudice, but also racism, misogyny, prejudice against disabled people, immigrants, asylum seekers, and so on. Why do I say that? We know that no child is born bigoted. A baby does not come out of the womb with bigoted attitudes. Those are learned from peers and often shamefully from parents and other adults around them. Now, if we can have equality and diversity lessons from an early age, which can challenge prejudice, we know from experimental research in some schools that prejudice attitudes go way, way down. And that reduces bullying in schools. It also creates adults who don't go on in later life to victimize others because of who they are. So it's in the interest of society, as well as the individuals potentially affected, that we have equality and diversity lessons in our schools. It's vital for social and community cohesion. It's vital for the economy. You know, if you've got racists and homophobes running amok in workplaces, or even not running amok, but just making life unpleasant for fellow workers, that undermines the morale of the workplace. It diminishes a person's performance because they feel unvalued and threatened and menaced. So if you want to have a good economy, you want to ensure that every person in the workplace is valued, appreciated, accepted, and respected. And that's how and why equality and diversity lessons can be so useful to secure that. The other related educational issue is, of course, the appallingly low standards of sex and relationship education. All the surveys of young people say time and time again that sex and relationship education was woefully inadequate. So many schools do not address issues like consent and abuse. They don't deal with emotions. They don't deal with how you negotiate through problems in relationships. They don't teach young people about how to have sexual pleasure for yourself and for your partner. And they don't teach properly about safer sex. You know, a lot of these HIV lessons are about how to roll a condom on a banana. Well, that may be a good start, but hey, that's not real, proper HIV prevention education. What schools teach young people what to do if their partner won't wear a condom? Very, very few. Very few teach about alternatives to intercourse as a safer but equally pleasurable way of achieving sexual fulfillment. Those things should be taught in schools. For all young people, LGBTI and straight. Right now, you may know there's a big campaign to make sex and relationship education mandatory in every school. At the moment it's not. Schools can pick and choose, and lots of faith schools either don't teach it or teach it in a very perfunctory manner, just about the ins and outs of reproduction, not actually about sex or relationships, let alone emotions and feelings. And allied to that campaign is, of course, the push to get all sex and relationship made mandatory and inclusive of LGBTI issues. A recent National Union of Students poll found that less than 20% of students surveyed said that their sex and relationship education included any reference to LGBTI kids and to same-sex relationships. Less than 20%. That's a massive failure. A massive failure. And one thing you can do is lobby your Member of Parliament, or indeed in the upcoming election your candidates, to get them to publicly commit that they will support mandatory sex and relationship education in schools, inclusive of LGBTI issues. Another aspect of unfinished business is, of course, the shocking levels of anti-LGBTI hate crimes. We know from the research that about a third of all LGBTI people in this country have been victims of homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic hate crimes. That's nearly 1 million people. And in some cases it's just abuse, threats and insults. In other cases, it's actual physical violence. And in many instances, the people affected have not just suffered one hate crime, they have suffered 2, 3, 4 or 5 over their lifetime. Now, the attitude and response of the police is much, much better than it once was. No doubt about that. And that's down to all the activists who lobbied, pressured, campaigned and protested to make the police take anti-LGBT hate crimes seriously, because for many years they didn't. When I look back into the history of the LGBTI group outrage, the two reasons we were formed in 1990 were that the police, on the one hand, dealt with homophobic hate crimes in a perfunctory, derisory manner. In most cases. There were some exceptions, but in most cases, LGBTI hate crimes were not treated seriously by the police. We were deemed to be criminals, not deserving of the protection of the law. I did some research and found that in the period 1986 to 1991, over 50 men were murdered in circumstances that pointed to a homophobic motive. Either attacked in their homes without being robbed, attacked in the street or at a public toilet or a park where gay men are known to go, often murdered in grotesque, frenzied ways. 30, 50, 70 stab wounds. Not the normal profile of a typical murder, but very much the profile of a hate crime murder. And these are just the men that I was able to identify because people either informed me or I managed to discover them trawling through local newspapers. The real figure, I'm no doubt about it, was much, much higher. The police were not taking it seriously. Instead, they were devoting all their energies and efforts to arresting gay men for consenting victims' behaviour. In 1989, I did some research. I managed to get the permission of the Home Office to go through their criminal statistics and analyse the arrests of gay and bisexual men. I looked at the main offence I looked at was the gross indecency one, the Oscar Wilde Alan Turing law. And I found that in 1989, over 2,000 men in England and Wales alone were convicted of that offence. almost as great as in 1954-55, when the country was gripped by a McCarthyite-style anti-gay witch hunt. So those were the reasons that outrage came into existence. The police were devoting huge efforts to arresting gay and bisexual men for consenting victimless behaviour and doing relatively little to deal with the wave of homophobic attacks and murders. As I said, there's been a great improvement since. But that's because we shamed and embarrassed the police. I can remember invading the press conferences of the then Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Paul Condon, occupying police stations that were organising stakeouts and entrapment operations against gay men. Many of us got arrested to highlight the way in which the police were persecuting us rather than protecting us. But we now do have progress, and most forces have reasonably good LGBTI awareness training. But that does not diminish the fact that still 1/3 of all LGBTI people have been victims of hate crimes. There's also a question of how the law is interpreted and enforced. You can have very good laws, but if they're not interpreted and enforced, then you've lost half the battle. Many of you will know that there's been a whole series of reggae and dancehall music stars like Buju Banton, Elephant Man, Bounty Killer, and so on, have put out records that openly advocate the murder of LGBTI people. These aren't merely homophobic tracks, they are incitements to murder, which is a criminal offence in this country, and in Jamaica, and in almost every country in the world. Yet they've never been prosecuted. In fact, successive Home Secretaries, both Labour and Conservative, gave these performers visas and work permits to come to Britain to spread their hate. And the police protected their concerts so they could perform and stir up anti-LGBTI hatred. And we know from members of the Afro-Caribbean community and the African community in this country that when they came to this country and when their records were big, there were spikes in violent attacks, mostly on black and ethnic minority LGBTI people. The police just sat there with folded arms and watched. Now you'll know that the leader of the Nation of Islam in the United States, Louis Farrakhan, has been banned from this country for over 20 years. I don't agree with his religion or politics, but he has never advocated violence as far as I know. Yet he's been banned for over 2 decades, while these singers have been welcomed to this country, allowed to perform and spread their poisonous hate. So you can see what I'm talking about. You may have the law, but if the law isn't enforced, what's the point? Likewise with hate clerics. You may be familiar with the case of Abdullah al-Faisal, the Islamist extremist cleric who I think in 2004 was convicted of inciting the murder of Jews and Hindus. He was taken to court and jailed for 9 years. Actually, in my view, a slightly excessive sentence, but nevertheless, he got 9 years. Around the same time, another Islamist extremist, Abdul Muhid in East London, advocated the killing of homosexuals. And even though there were 4 witnesses who testified to what he'd said, the Crown Prosecution Service refused to prosecute him. You're probably all familiar with the case of Damilola Taylor. Did you know that he was a victim of homophobic bullying and assaults just days before his murder? The police covered that up. I was contacted by one of the officers on the case who'd been lent on to not make any public reference to it. The fact that he'd been assaulted on the Friday before he was murdered on the Monday as a gay boy was of direct material relevance to find the perpetrators. Normally in most murder cases, or any kind of violent attack, the police will look into past history where this person, the victim, had been threatened or attacked. And they will publicise that in the hope that witnesses will come forward. Well, in the case of Damnall Taylor, there was a complete police silence. And indeed, when the notorious Archbishop of York, John Sentamu, did his report, his extensive public inquiry report into the Damnall case, it was about this thick. It covered everything from the state of the pavements and the street lighting, but didn't mention a word about those homophobic assaults and threats against Damnall Taylor. So you can understand why I'm saying that good laws are not enough. You have to have good enforcement as well. Another unfinished business is the blood restrictions affecting gay and bisexual men. Thankfully, apart from Northern Ireland yet again, we no longer have a lifetime ban on gay and bisexual blood donors. We now have a 12-month deferral period in which a gay or bisexual man who's ever in their life had oral or anal sex with another man cannot give blood for 12 months after their last same-sex experience. Now, I'm all in favour of protecting the blood supply, but that is not a medically or scientifically justified exclusion period. You know, every blood donation is now tested in 3 ways. And you can now detect HIV within 2 to 3 weeks of infection. So why have we got a 12-month deferral period? It's true that hepatitis C can take up to 3 months to show up in a person's blood after the date of infection. And in the case of hepatitis B, maybe in some instances up to 6 months. But if people are vaccinated against hepatitis, that's not an issue. So my argument is, why not ask gay and bisexual men a few more questions on the blood donation form, i.e., are you vaccinated against hepatitis A, B, and C? A few more questions about their sexual practices. And then you could probably, in most instances, reduce the deferral period to about 3 months. Now, that is based on scientific and medical evidence, not based on a generalization about gay and bisexual men. It's shocking to think that heterosexual men and women who may be very promiscuous and may have lots of unprotected sex in the United States, this country, or Europe, they can give blood fine. There's no restrictions on them. But if you're a gay and bisexual man, even if you always practice safer sex, even if you always use a condom, if the condom never fails, even if you test HIV negative, you still can't give blood until 12 months after your last same-sex experience. That's a policy based on prejudice, not medical fact. And the final issue I'd raise is, of course, the question of the way in which LGBTI refugees are treated in this country. Let's be clear, all refugees are treated shamefully. The government's agenda, following the whistle from UKIP and the Daily Mail, is to reduce the number of refugees. The government, the Home Office, are not interested in the circumstances of the individual. All they want to do is reduce the numbers. So they've devised a devious system to help increase the likelihood of people being refused and deported. First of all, they've cut legal aid. So the amount of money that solicitors now can get to prepare asylum applications is very restrictive. No solicitor can prepare a proper asylum claim based on the funds made available. And that's, as I say, it's deliberate. It's a deliberate ploy to fail as many people as possible. That wasn't good enough for the government. When I say the government, I mean both Labour did it, and the Conservatives who perpetuated it. That wasn't good enough. They've introduced fast track, detention and fast track, whereby refugees are put in asylum detention centres, which are basically glorified prisons by another name, and they're put on fast track, which gives them about 2 weeks to prepare an asylum claim and to do an appeal if they're refused. Now, first of all, if you're locked up, you don't have the freedom or capacity to get the information, the evidence you need to prepare a successful claim. If you've been tortured in your home country, to get medical evidence of torture takes months. If you were arrested or jailed in your home country, to get the evidence from the police, the courts, and the prison system in your home country, if you can get it at all, will take many months. Obviously, on first application, the vast majority of genuine LGBTI refugees are refused. They're refused because they're put in a situation where they don't have the capacity to prepare a proper claim. You have to get an expert witness who will provide testimony about the scale of homophobic, biphobic and transphobic persecution in the person's country of origin. It often, in some countries' case, takes a long time to find the appropriate legal expert or academic who can provide that written evidence. And then it takes them time to prepare. So for all these different reasons, that is why the refusal rate is so high for LGBTI refugees. And to me, it is particularly shocking that refugees who've often suffered grave persecution, arrest, torture, imprisonment, attempts to kill them, attempts to kill their partners, being driven out of their homes, they come here to seek a safe haven, and we put them in a detention centre. It's like we're putting them back in the very place they've fled from. That is a sheer, absolute denial of our obligation under the 1951 Refugee Convention. So that's an issue which we really have to address. Now, I've got to say that in many, many cases, probably the majority of cases, most of the LGBTI refugees who do win their claims only do so because they've managed to make contact with friends and supporters on the outside. If they have to battle alone with their solicitor, they'll probably not succeed. But the refugees that are supported by my Peter Tatchell Foundation, by the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, by No Going Back and Asylum Aid, these refugees nearly always win. But it's only because they have this huge backup to get the medical evidence, to get the expert witness report, to get the testimony from friends and families, to collate evidence to demonstrate that the person is LGBTI and they've suffered persecution. And although the coalition government promised before the last election that it would fix the system, it hasn't. It may have made some improvements. There have been some improvements, but a lot of them are in theory. So, for example, it's been ruled that asylum adjudicators and caseworkers and Home Office barristers are not allowed to ask intimate, intrusive questions. I'll just give you an example. What they used to say to try and disprove a person's sexuality or gender identity, they would ask things like, are you the active or the passive partner? You know, what is it about penetration that you enjoy? How long does it take you to reach orgasm? How large is your partner's penis? Or in the case of a woman, they'll ask all intimate questions about the vagina, the labia, and so on. In theory, they're not allowed to ask these questions anymore. But I know from my experience that they still are. They still are. Not in every case. I mean, some have moved on or are not doing that. But in some cases, they still are asking those grossly intrusive questions. I mean, back until 2010, the government policy was that they would sometimes eventually accept that an LGBTI person had been persecuted in their home country. But they would say, well, we accept that, but we believe you can go back to your home country and behave with discretion, and then no one will know you're gay, and you won't be persecuted. And behave with discretion with suggestions like change your name, move to a part of the country where no one knows you, and stop having gay sex. Then no one will know you're gay, and you won't suffer any further victimization. They would never ever say that to a political, religious, or ethnic refugee. But thankfully, in 2010, the High Court ruled that as unlawful. Unlawful. So what the Home Office now does is dispute a person's sexuality. That's the new tactic. We don't believe you're gay. And this has prompted some LGBT refugees who are so desperate that they have filmed and photographed themselves having sex with their partner and presented it to the Asylum Tribunal as evidence. And these are often people from deeply conservative, religious cultures and communities where any personal intimacy of any kind, let alone displaying it, is regarded as deeply offensive and shameful. But they've gone to this extent out of desperation. In some instances, that isn't good enough. The Home Office will turn around and say, we think you're faking it. There was a notorious case about a year and a bit ago where a man presented evidence of him being penetrated during anal intercourse by his partner. And the Home Office barrister turned around and said, I see this evidence of you having gay sex, but I note that while you're being penetrated, you haven't got an erection, therefore you can't be gay. As if gay men or bisexual men are supposed to have permanent tumescence. I mean, this is the depravity of the asylum system. So that most definitely needs to change. So that sort of is about a general overview of what still needs to be done here in Britain. I'll just briefly mention that, of course, by comparison to much of the rest of the world, we are very, very lucky. There are still about 80 countries where homosexuality, mostly male homosexuality, but sometimes female homosexuality as well, is totally illegal in all circumstances. And the penalties range from just a few years imprisonment, right up to life imprisonment, and even the death penalty in about half a dozen Islamist countries. The death penalty in the 21st century for a consenting adult same-sex relationship. Unbelievable. Even more appalling, more than half of these countries are members of the Commonwealth. 41 out of the 53 Commonwealth member states have a total prohibition on homosexuality. That's 80% of Commonwealth member states. 7 of them have life imprisonment, and in parts of 2 of them, Pakistan and Nigeria, LGBTI people can be put to death under Sharia law. Have you ever heard the Commonwealth Secretary General speak out against this? You haven't. He has 3 or 4 times, but at Commonwealth meetings and mostly unreported. But when Brunei introduced plans for Sharia law, including the stoning to death of adulterers and homosexuals, there was no public condemnation from the Commonwealth Secretary General. When Nigeria introduced its new anti-gay law, when Uganda introduced its new anti-gay law, and so on and so on and so on, there was no visible, vocal, public condemnation. The Commonwealth says, we are pursuing quiet diplomacy. Great, if it works, but obviously it hasn't. Ever since the Commonwealth pursued quiet diplomacy, more and more Commonwealth member states are witch hunting and persecuting LGBTI people. Because they've got the message, the Commonwealth doesn't care. By their silence and inaction, the Commonwealth Secretariat sends a signal that it doesn't really care. I've got to add that this also applies to other human rights abuses. The death penalty, detention without trial, torture, which are widely practiced by many Commonwealth countries. The Commonwealth Secretariat is silent. Even though there's a Commonwealth Charter, which all the member states have signed, which amongst other things guarantees equal human rights for every Commonwealth citizen, which includes us. In the 25 years that I've been involved, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting has always refused to even discuss LGBTI human rights. It won't even allow it on the agenda. You know, we need a real wake-up call to the Commonwealth. And there are some great people there who are trying to push as best they can. But they are mostly small, marginal, minor voices. They too are not given a platform. So when we look at the global situation, we see that things are far from fair and equal in the vast majority of the world's 193 nations. And in fact, in about 15 or 20 nations, things are going backwards, with new anti-gay laws, intensified persecution. I just got an email yesterday from the LGBT group in Azerbaijan, informing me that, sadly, they have to close down because the physical violent threats against their organizations and their members is so great that they fear being killed. And a lot of them are going underground or going to go abroad. You know, all across the world, in 15, 20 countries, things are going seriously backward. But those 15 to 20 countries are, of course, a minority. So there is a backlash. We shouldn't, underestimate it or ignore it. But we should also hold on to the fact that in most of the world's countries, LGBTI people are making progress. We are gradually, slowly winning. And in the process of winning, we're not only winning for LGBTI people, we're winning for everyone. Because when you roll back state repression against one group, it encourages, emboldens and empowers other groups to have the confidence to also take on their repressive, tyrannical regimes. So I got wonderful news yesterday. Just moments after the email from Azerbaijan, I got the email from Nepal. The parliament there has recommended, or the parliamentary committee there, has recommended that Nepal legalize same-sex marriage. Little tiny Nepal. Who would have thought? Only less than 15 years out of dictatorship, under a harsh homophobic monarchy which persecuted lots of citizens, including LGBTI ones. Now, about 15 years later, they're talking about same-sex marriage. It shows that the battle for LGBT rights is global. And gradually, slowly, we are winning. For this very simple reason. The quest for justice, the thirst for freedom, is something that no regime, no matter how tyrannical, can ever suppress and kill. Eventually, even in the most homophobic, transphobic, and biphobic circumstances, justice and freedom will win out. So my closing thought is, queer freedom may have been long delayed in many parts of the world, but one thing for sure, it cannot be denied. Thank you.
For a really compelling and also. I think we're probably up against time, unless you want to take any quick questions. But not, yes?
Yeah, questions. We have to give the audience a chance to speak.
Okay.
Put me on the spot.
I'll leave you to think about it.
Can I just say, if any of you are thinking of leaving, on the front tables here, there are some flyers about my Human Rights Foundation. Please take one. Please sign up. I'll give you a bit more detail about that. They're at the front here and here and here. So if you leave, take one, please. Yeah, so anybody got any questions or contributions? Yes?
Sorry, I've written it down so I'll get there. I'm a born-again Christian and I'm aware of a lot of biblical ignorance regarding whether being gay is wrong or right. I believe it's perfectly acceptable to God to be gay or straight. What more do you think Christian churches can do to welcome lesbian gay community? Not just for getting married, but to be part of the Christian faith.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because in the process of the campaign for same-sex marriage, the one thing that gave me great hope, well, one of several things, but one thing that did give me great hope was I think it was the YouGov poll, which found that 55% of people of faith in Britain supported same-sex civil marriage. So the mainstream religious leaders were out of touch with the humanitarian aspirations and feelings of their congregations. So we must be very careful to not have a blanket condemnation of people of faith and assume they're all homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic. And I guess my mother is a case in point. She, like you, is a born-again evangelical Christian. I would say that she borders on the fundamentalist. She still believes to this day, despite all my human rights and LGBTI activism, she still believes to this day that homosexuality is wrong because it says so in the Bible. Well, she takes a very literalist point of view. But to her credit, she also says it's not a major sin. Compared to greed or theft or racism, it's a very minor one. She also says that a far worse sin is homophobia. I can remember when I went into the pulpit at Canterbury Cathedral in 1998 on Easter Sunday with my outraged colleagues to protest against the then Archbishop of Canterbury and his support for discrimination against LGBTI people in law. He was opposed to an equal age consent, he was opposed to same-sex couples fostering or adopting kids. He didn't believe there should be any legal recognition for same-sex relationships and so on. That, of course, made headlines all around the world, including back in my homeland of Australia. My mother saw it on the TV news, and when I next phoned up, she said, "Oh, Peter, did you really have to?" To which my response was, well, we tried to have a dialogue with the Archbishop for 8 years. He wouldn't even meet us. He would not even meet us. So we felt in desperation we had to go to his church, to his cathedral, and call him out. And to my mother's credit, she said, "Good for you." So yeah, you know, there are lots of people of faith in all the faiths who do not follow the traditional, dogmatic, orthodox interpretations of Scripture and hold true to the core values of love and compassion, which are at the heart of all the great religions.
I have a suggestion, if I may, particularly since the I has been added to the LGBTI. It's quite new, and it's very important. Can we please get away from the idea of opposite sex and call it different sex? Please.
I have tried that, but a lot of people say, what's different sex? So there's a learning curve. I mean, everybody knows what opposite sex means. People often get very confused about different sex, but I agree that is the ideal, better expression, because same sex, different sex, they are the polar opposite. Yeah.
What are your views, Peter, about...
Can you shout?
What are your views about the pardoning of all those who have been convicted in the past of gross indecency or convicted of homosexual acts, whether they're alive or dead? There's a campaign now about that. What are your views?
Well, as you all know, Alan Turing was granted first a government apology and then a royal pardon over his conviction for homosexual acts in the 1950s. And that is a very good thing. But my argument is, having established the principle that his conviction was wrong under anti-gay laws, surely an apology and a pardon should also be extended to all the other men convicted under the same law or other similar anti-gay laws. Now, the figure of 49,000 has been often quoted. That's the minimum number of men convicted under that one law, gross indecency. If you add in all the other anti-gay laws like buggery, soliciting, procuring, and so on, you're talking about somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 men. And so the new petition that's up on the change.org website does focus on Alan Turing and gross indecency. It does mention that there should be a pardon for all men convicted of all diverse anti-gay laws. Now, I feel somewhat ambivalent about the pardon issue because a pardon sort of implies you did wrong, but we're going to forgive you. I don't think those men did anything wrong. So that's why I'm arguing for both a pardon and an apology. The government could give a very simple, clear, blanket, universal apology. It could say, we apologise, as the government of the United Kingdom, to all men convicted of consenting adult same-sex relations under Britain's historic anti-gay laws, which have now been repealed. When it comes to a pardon, it's a bit more complex because there are so many different myriad laws, and often people were convicted of perhaps some things that they should not be pardoned for under those laws. So, for example, gross indecency is a consenting offence. You cannot be convicted of that offence unless both partners consented. But in some cases, not very often, but in a small number of cases, it may have involved an older man with a younger man under the age of consent. Or it may have involved sex in a public place where members of the public witnessed it and were offended. So what I'm suggesting is that rather than a blanket pardon, we're talking about 50 to 100,000 men, I think it should be the right of a person still living, or in the case of a deceased person, their partner, family, loved ones, friends, family, or a third party, to apply for a pardon, and then each individual circumstance would be assessed. And on that basis, the pardon should be granted if they fulfill the criterion of a consenting adult same-sex relationship. So please go to the change.org website and sign that petition. I think it's over 150,000 people now. We want to get up to 200,000.
Hi Peter, I'm a member of the Church of England clergy, but change. You'll know that the Church of England treats us as employees when it suits them and we're not when it suits them. Do you think it's realistic, and how soon do you think we'll see any changes with that?
I think it probably could be a bit of a battle, but I do think we're reaching a moment very soon when there's a fighting chance we could get it. And I think as more and more individual clergy speak out about their personal experience, I think the case for closing those loopholes will grow. So, you know, I'm optimistic, but it really needs to be a campaign primarily led by people within the church and supported by those of us on the outside acting in solidarity. I think if the initiative comes from within the church, the chances of success are much greater. But we are going to face the resistance of the church establishment, who want to hold on to those privilege exemptions. And in my experience, don't really have any strong arguments to justify it, apart from the fact that we are a voluntary organisation, we have a right to make our own rules. Well, we don't accept that when it comes to racism. We say, you know, you may be a voluntary organisation, but you're not entitled to practice racism. And I think the same principle should apply to the church and the employment and service given to LGBTI people.